There was no sleep to be had that night. And what, give the monsters another shot at us in our nightmares? I don't think so. Besides, for all we knew, this was only the first wave of them, so using the scattered bits of our fire to see by, we broke camp right then and there. Once the manticores were resaddled and our gear stowed, Joseph stomped out the remaining flames. These had been feebly holding back the night, but now it poured in around us. Aerials can fly in the dark, but May suggested they not, that we all stay close together, at least until sunup. So Remy rode with her and Flo with me. We set off promptly but slowly through the gloom. The twin moons were in different phases and neither one was anywhere near full. As I said I would, I then discovered that the manticore's sense of sight is incredible, even in pitch blackness. This, I assumed, was probably due to the abnormal largeness of their eyes. We didn't have to guide the animals. May had us simply point them in the direction she knew to be the coast. They carried us faithfully through the long night, permitting their riders to get some saddle sleep, small naps interrupted periodically by bursts of alarmed wakefulness. That's how we spent the night, in a constant cycle of dozing off and jolting up. The only one to never falter was May. Her half-lit eyes never closed for more than a blink. And I'm not even sure if the amalgam did that, honestly, ever watchful for a threat as she was. The woman was a machine. But even she couldn't see the topography changing beneath us. At some point, however, we could smell the alteration. The briny aroma was thickening in the air, and soon enough we could hear our destination as well, rolling and roaring in the distance. Somewhere out in the darkness, an ocean awaited us. We were nearly there. The coast. The border of the Strangel's domain. The Land's End. This is the Endless Elsewhere podcast. Chapter 18, The Ragged Edge. When the night finally yielded to day, it wasn't the dramatic transition we were used to by now. There was only a subtle lightening of the world around us. Clouds had gathered, both in the sky and along the surface, it seemed. Typical of any coastal area, it was now blanketed in a dense fog. A weather front had moved in. Visibility was greatly restricted, but it was still an improvement over total darkness. I leaned over in the saddle and peered down, able to see the ground now. It was still grassy, but getting sandier with every long stride of our manticores. We were coming up on the shoreline, to the beach. Noticing this also, May quietly brought us to a halt. This was a good place to leave our animals. The poor things had been on the move all of yesterday and then most of last night. As if that wasn't enough, the manticores had also been in a fight and taken injuries from the lycanthropes. Beyond all apparent danger and able to see again, I assumed that we would now tend to their wounds. Our mounts, however, took care of themselves. They began to lick not only their own gashes, but one another's, just as animals do on Earth. There is something in their saliva that works to clot blood and fight infection. As they nursed one another, we unsaddled the manticores. The saddlebags, I only then learned, doubled as satchels when detached. Each of us slung one over a shoulder. We were taking our supplies with us because our animals were staying behind. As always, we knew the loyal, well-trained manticores would not wander off in our absence. With just as much confidence did they trust that we would be back, that we were not abandoning them. Even still, Guts, Lomray, and Jellybean watched us walk off into the fog with concern in their big eyes. We moved over increasingly sandy ground until that's all it was. Our hike became rather laborious. Every step was sucked down and submerged by the sediment, having to be forcibly unearthed for the next. It was rather taxing, so I was relieved to find solid ground again. At least, I thought it was solid ground. I'd stepped upon a slab of stone, a massive but mostly buried one. I paused to look around, the fog permitting me to see only so far. Even still, I spotted others. Joseph noticed that I'd stopped and reversed a couple of steps to my side. "What is this?"
A monolith. It's one of many. They used to be upright, forming a henge.
A henge? Like Stonehenge?
Pretty much. Gentry and the Aerials toppled these on their way to lay siege to the island chain.
Why bother?
These were used by the Atlantean conjurers to focus and amplify their dark arts.
Conjurers? As in magicians? As in, is this your card?
No, these were actual wizards.
Really?
We've talked a lot about how technologically advanced they were, but to reach the levels that they did, the Atlanteans, as instructed by the Nephilim, combined science with sorcery. They were alchemists, more or less.
Something else you failed to mention in all the time we discussed the books, Joseph. Magic.
I told you to read them.
Is that why the Grimalkin came to this place?
Oh, that's very interesting what you just said. If it really is the witch as Gentry thought, then yeah, maybe.
But what exactly is she up to?
I guess we'll find out soon enough.
From the curtain of fog hanging before us, May called softly. We'd become separated from our companions, so we hurried to rejoin them. Our leader commanded us all to stay close, and we did, moving as one now. The sound of the ocean was growing with each step we put toward it. Just when we expected to finally behold it, however, a wall of dunes appeared instead. The aerials outstretched their wings, ready to fly to the top, but May stopped them. She was serious about us staying together, but also the flighted people could give us away. Even through this soup, their bright eyes and wings might be visible from the archipelago. Yes, the witch apparently knew we were coming, but she didn't need to know we had arrived, so our quintet started up the sandy embankment in a sinking, slipping march. We were partly climbing, partly crawling by the time we reached the top. Surmounting the dunes in a clumsy clamber, we then righted ourselves and caught our breath. Now, finally, we were to have a well-earned look at our destination. But, as I should have guessed it would be, the fog bank was at its thickest out to sea. We could see no farther than the beach below us. It was actually quite unnerving to know that an entire ocean was sprawling before us and not be able to lay eyes on it. The only water we could see was the tide rolling in and out from the thick mist. Even creepier was knowing that the Lost Isles were lurking out there somewhere. I should have been disappointed, but was weirdly relieved to have the archipelago hidden from me. But whatever horror I feared of that place, it had reached the shore already. There was blood in the sand. With a couple of silent gestures, May instructed us to shed the satchels and to ready our weapons. Then we sidled and slid down the sandy dunes to the beach. We passed by one of several old watch posts, the tall wooden structures now rickety with age. They resembled lifeguard towers and had been used similarly, but they had not helped the aerial lookouts spot what was coming, and may have even made them easier targets. Flo and Remy kept their wings closed and their eyes half-lidded in an effort to remain as clandestine as possible. Again, we did not wish to give ourselves away. The fog could be concealing enemies, but we could be cloaked by it as well. We were following May, who was following one of the longer blood trails. It ended the only way it could have, with a body. A killed Ariel lay before us, terribly contorted. He was missing half a wing and an arm. We moved on and found another body. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth heap of gore. The carnage ended with a sixth corpse, but this one differed from the rest. It was a man with the rotten shell of a beast splayed out around him. At least the Ariels had taken out one of the lycanthropes. The scenario was clear enough. The werewolves had swum from the archipelago to the mainland, ambushing the Ariel guards before moving inland to do the same to us. But the Sentinels had been less successful in repelling the surprise attack than we had. Now we knew why no fresh report had been flown into Airy Castle. All the Ariels assigned to the coast were dead. Remy then said something in the language of his people, something in a wavering tone, and was answered by Flo, who chimed in with a more encouraging timbre. Then both looked to May for her response.
May, what's going on?
Rhemigrayne believes we should turn back to gather reinforcements, that the threat here is greater than expected. He may be correct.
And you, Flo?
She says we should proceed.
Flo can answer for herself, May.
Very well. Flodoorwen?
Keep going.
I agree with her. We've come this far, we shouldn't turn back now. Carrying the secret about her and Gentry, my regard for May had been quietly changing, but this was the first display of it. I had grown colder toward her, or maybe just warmer toward Flo, with whom I had just sided against our leader. It was, of course, impossible to tell whether May was hurt by this, not May the machine. The amalgam looked from me to Joseph. In our democracy of 5, we had 2 for and 2 against, so he had to break the tie.
What say you, Joseph?
We were sent here to do a job, so let's do the job.
Then it is decided. But first
we had to see to the bodies. It was determined that we would give the slain Ariels temporary burials on the beach. The cold sand would be easy enough to dig in and would preserve them until they could be collected later. After our mission was complete, after this place had been made safe, we'd return to the castle and dispatch other Ariels to this beach. They would gather the remains of these brave souls and deliver them back to their homeland to be interred in their rightful places in the crypt, in the mountain of their maker. Joseph and I moved to help, but Remy snapped at us, in his own tongue, of course. He would not deign to speak English. May directed us to patrol the beach while she and the other natives dug the graves. This she did to settle Remy's temper. He didn't want us humans assisting in the burial of his brethren when other humans had killed them. His anger was certainly compounded by the fact that both of these humans had just voted him down. So, yeah, emotions were running high, which is why May had dismissed us. We stepped away without argument. It was better to have at least a couple of us on guard anyway, and if we didn't want to share the fate of the aerial lookouts, we had to be more vigilant. This had proven a deadly place indeed, but not just for the aerials and humans. Joseph and I soon happened upon yet another kind of corpse. It materialized through the fog ahead of us, lying closer to the water's edge than any we'd found so far. That's because it had washed ashore. On its side, facing away from us, the tide was working it farther up the sand, inch by inch. This creature had died in the ocean, but it had lived there first. Joseph sprinted ahead and I chased after. When I caught up, he knelt down to the corpse. My husband knew what this was even before he took hold of its sizable dorsal fin and turned the body over. This was an aquatic, as Gentry called them, one of the people of the sea. It was humanoid, sharing the same basic design as us and the Strangels. But that's where the similarities ended. Its body was incredibly thin and covered in greenish scales. The hands and feet were exceedingly long, their digits webbed and clawed. Being forever closed, I did not immediately identify a set of gills that bent around this creature's sides, following the narrow curve of its ribcage. It was the head and face where I concentrated most of my attention. There were no ears whatsoever, and no nose beyond a pair of slitted nostrils. Even if there had been these features, they would have been overshadowed by the dominance of the creature's eyes. The oval pair were as black as they were enormous, and actually wrapped around to the sides of his head. Now for the mouth of him. This one's hung open in death, the distended jaw gaping enormously and displaying its rows of serrated teeth. We didn't know what this dead aquatic meant, only that it was worth reporting to the others. My husband rose up, and together he and I twisted to make a swift return to our companions. We froze almost immediately, though, as we saw another aquatic, a living one, emerging from the fog. He was not coming from the ocean, which was now at our backs, but from inland. The creature had spotted us before we had him, and had moved forward, a webbed hand raised in greeting. But now that we faced him, now that the aquatic could see us plainly, he stopped abruptly. Then that raised hand of his lowered and joined the other, which was wrapped around a sizable harpoon. It was not his weapon or his suddenly hostile demeanor that claimed my focus, but rather the apparatus he wore. It was exactly what it looked like: reverse diving equipment. The human version of this would have supplied the user with oxygen, but here, the life-giving necessity was water. The apparatus was a collection of different parts, all interconnected. The aquatic wore a wetsuit of sorts, with a network of veiny tubing that ran throughout it. I was looking at an external circulatory system that cycled water continuously across his body, but most importantly to the gills that I knew to be along his ribs. The water was sourced in the twin tanks that hung on the creature's back, one on either side of his fin. The pair were secured in place by a harness. To this was also attached the helmet he wore. This was essentially a transparent sphere. I knew it wasn't actually made of glass, but of some other more durable material. Whatever its substance, the transparency had been reduced by design, tinted, to keep his dark eyes from being overwhelmed by the greater light experienced on dry land. Not that it was much of a problem on a day like today. Even through the tinting, even through the water, we could see his face, but couldn't read any expression. His body language, however, was still coming through loud and clear. He was ready to fight us. I didn't know what to do. Joseph at least had an idea. He raised his hand, attempting to return the aquatic's now abandoned wave of greeting. The response was less than desirable. The aquatic charged, intent on running his harpoon through us both. I drew my saber faster than Joseph could get his spikes in place, and so parried the first thrust of the aquatic. Then Joseph joined the fight, but the two of us could not overcome the creature. Even as a fish out of water, he was faster than us. I soon realized why he was attacking us. We were human. He thought we were Atlanteans. Unfortunately, we couldn't just tell him we weren't. There was something of a language barrier between us, so we let our actions do the talking. Joseph and I fought defensively, never going on the offensive. Whenever an opening came to strike at the aquatic, we would leave the opportunity untaken, trying to demonstrate as best we could that we were not his enemy. And whenever he would give back, tiring, we would do the same, then lower our weapons. but then he'd rush us again, and again we'd have it out. This would have continued indefinitely had the clanging of our weapons not reached the Strangels farther down the beach. The aquatic was as relieved as we were by the sight of them coming through the fog. He must have thought his allies were coming to support him, but then they fell in with Joseph and I. He could not fathom what betrayal this must be and fought even harder. Fortunately, before there was any actual bloodshed, Remy explained the situation. The Ariel spoke a bit of the aquatic language. Well, I say spoke.
What is he doing with his hands?
The aquatics have their own sign language, and Remy seems to know a bit of it.
The more he communicated with Remy, the calmer the aquatic became, an experience I'd yet to have with the Ariel myself, but whatever. Having explained our presence here, it was his turn now, and the man of the sea had much to convey. Remy had to interrupt him periodically so that he could fill in the rest of us. The Ariel started off in his native tongue, but May insisted that he speak for all of us to understand. With a grimace, he complied. In broken English, he spoke, telling us what he had learned. First off, the aquatic had mistaken Joseph for Gentry. At a distance, through the fog, it was understandable as my husband apparently shares a likeness with this man. A similar build at least, enough so that Joseph could fit his clothing, which had all but ensured the misidentification. I knew this all too well, thinking back to Season 2 when the Bard had thought me Adelaide Pendergast, simply because I donned some of her wardrobe.
Well, you can tell him there's a couple more friendly humans here now.
When did he see Gentry last?
I glanced at May as she cut in, thinking her lashing back at me for earlier. I said nothing about it though, as I also wanted an answer to her question. Remy translated the inquiry into the oceanic sign language. The aquatic's webbed, clawed hands moved swiftly in reply. Remy had trouble keeping up and often asked the man of the sea to slow down or repeat himself. But the Ariel eventually learned that Gentry and his clan were living on the coast. Before anyone could get excited, however, Remy explained that it was the coast opposite to this one.
He's on the other side of the continent.
But at least we know where he is now.
May sounded hopeful, excited even. I bet she was. Remy went on to describe a peninsula that Joseph knew from Gentry's manuscript. Apparently just off the tip of it was a coral reef in which the aquatics had built an outpost. Having been ousted by the Strangels, the human and his household had gone to them seeking sanctuary. Even though they were on land, it was still within the realm of the aquatics. Their kind, having devised the breathing apparatuses, had come up from the depths to explore the dry parts of their world, staking claims on certain territories. It was during these expeditions that they first met the Ariels generations ago and made an alliance with them. I wondered where that peace agreement stood now. The aquatics either did not know of the civil conflict brewing among their air-breathing allies, or simply did not care. They had granted the exiles permission to live in their domain, under their protection. If the cadre ended up as the dominant force in the realm of the Strangels, how long would it be until their purist, separationist ideals were extended to the people of the sea? After all, they, like humans, were non-Ariels. I thought about all of this as I looked to the aquatic.
What's his name?
Huh? Who?
Who do you think? The creature from the Black Lagoon over here.
Oh, of course. It'll just be a hand gesture, nothing we can vocalize. Gentry ran into the same problem.
Let me guess. He made up proper names for the ones he met?
He did, yeah. The pair of you seem to have that in common. So, what do you want to call our new friend?
Oh, I don't know. How about Gil?
Absolutely not.
Finn?
Babe, no fish puns.
Fine. You come up with a name.
Okay, I will.
Yes?
Don't rush me, I'm thinking. What do you think about Clyde?
Clyde?
Yeah, Clyde.
Okay, that's pretty good.
As Joseph and I were deciding on what to call him, Clyde had begun signing to Remy again. He still had much to tell the Ariel, his webbed hands going on for some minutes. As before, Remy read the gestures as best he could, but struggled to match the aquatic's pace. Eventually, Clyde had conveyed all that he needed to, and so the rest of us looked expectantly to Remy. The Ariel knew more of the oceanic sign language than he did English, but his fluency for both was incomplete. So instead of trying to translate for all of us again, he just put it all into his own native tongue. May permitted him to do so this time, listening intently. When he was done, she then turned to interpret for Joseph and I. Our leader hesitated, however, as if still trying to process what she'd been told. We grew impatient.
Has he seen the Grimalkin? The cat? Does he even know what that is?
How many of the Atlanteans are with her?
Is the witch still on the archipelago?
Why is he here on dry land?
And why is he—
Please, my friends.
Sorry, Maevalesse, go on.
He has not seen the Grimalkin, only the Atlanteans. But he has witnessed the unnatural glow emitting from the central island.
Where the Citadel once stood.
Yes, that is where all their activity had been concentrated. As for her forces, there does not seem to be any more humans with her. Not anymore.
Where'd they go?
They're still there, Lindsay, but are no longer human.
Oh, so more werewolves?
The witch changed half of her underlings into the brutes who attacked us in the plains. The other half she made into something else.
My husband's face wrenched as he looked to the water. Well, to the fog, under which was the water, and under that, the rest of our enemies. The Grimalkin's power for transmogrification was not restricted to lycanthropy. May went on to describe what Clyde had witnessed. Humans who'd been magically reworked into fish-like abominations that now swam the channel between our shore and those of the archipelago.
Merfolk.
Merfolk? Is that like...
Yeah.
So, first it was werewolves, and now it's mermaids?
And mermen, yes, but that's not all she's created. The Grimalkin has made a moat of the sea around the islands, which means she's digging in. She's fortifying.
She really does know we're coming. But what is she after? May, does he know anything else?
He does not.
Is he alone?
He is now. The others in his company were attacked by these monsters and massacred.
I looked to the dead aquatic who'd washed ashore, now knowing he was one of many. Clyde only escaped by going topside, to the dry land, with his apparatus. But now he was marooned here, unable to return to the water.
Does he know how many are down there?
Before the unholy warping of the Atlanteans, when he and his fellows were still spying upon them from the sea, they counted 18 humans.
18. We killed 8 back in the plains, plus the one the Ariels got. So there's 9 mermaids?
Oh, merfolk. It's merfolk, babe. And they only counted that many Atlanteans. There could have been more.
Not if they all actually came in a dinky little raft. It would only hold so many. Nearly 20 would be pushing it.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, let's assume the figure is accurate.
But the beasts we could fight on land. How are we to do battle with creatures in the sea?
We'll just have to get past them. Could the Ariels fly us over, one at a time?
Even if they could, we cannot leave our ally stranded here. He will die if we do.
Right. He's probably running low on air. Water.
So whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast.
But again, how are we to fight creatures of the sea?
We can't. Not on their turf, anyway. We need to get them out of the water.
What exactly are you proposing, Lindsay?
You guys ever go fishing on this world?
What?
How would we?
The werewolves didn't seem very intelligent, so it stands to reason the mermaids aren't either.
It's merfolk.
That means we can trick them, bait them to the surface.
Bait them with what?
Flo and Remy. Their brightly colored wings and glowing eyes will act as lures. They can fly over the surface, drawing the mermaids up from the depths.
Merfolk.
And then?
Spear fishing.
Exactly.
Explain.
May, we're gonna kill some mermaids.
Merfolk, babe. It's actually merfolk.
I know.
My plan was as follows. May would need to trade weapons with Remy, then he and Flo would flutter out over the water with the 2 spears we had in our group. Even through the water and the fog above it, their wings and eyes would be seen by the mermaids. Sorry, merfolk, who would then come to investigate. Once they'd broken the surface, the Ariels would then lance these black magic mutants and boom, problem solved. But it wouldn't be that simple. Once I'd laid it all out for our leader, May pointed out some obvious holes. Like I said, we only had the 2 spears with us, so what if one became stuck in a sea monster and got pulled down into the ocean? Or what if one of the creatures, after being speared, returned to the depths merely wounded and not killed? We now knew their number, but we had to be sure we got them all. To make certain that we eliminated every last one of these merfolk, there had to be a couple more steps to the plan. Brutal steps. These, just so everyone knows, were formulated by May. Doubtlessly, the merfolk would be too heavy for the Ariels to lift from the sea, so Flo and Remy, once they'd lanced one, would then have to force it to the beach. They'd fly low, close to the surface, driving the creature before them, relaying it to Joseph and Clyde, who'd be waiting on the sand. With the gauntlet barbs and the harpoon, the men would skewer the monster and drag it farther up the shore to where May and I would be waiting, she with Remy's mace and I with my saber. If the monster wasn't dead by the time it reached us, we were to finish it off, then roll it to the side where we could keep an easy tally of the merfolk. We would all work in pairs to assist one another. ensuring no one was overwhelmed. This strategy also had the 6 of us contributing to the slaughter of each monster. Remember, we were all very tired, so spreading the labor out like this would hopefully keep any of us from slipping up, something we absolutely could not afford at any stage of the process. Whether it was out over the water, or on the beach, or farther up the shore, if one of us made a mistake, it would be curtains for more than just the merfolk. It was suggested that we retrieve the manticores from inland and put them to work, their size and strength affording us a proper advantage, but May rejected their involvement. They were still recuperating. Besides, if we wanted to get home, we could not risk the animals. It was only our lives that were to be put on the line. Everyone understood this as well as the roles they had to play, so with nothing else to be said, we went about our gruesome business. Remy, now possessing May's spear and she his mace, exchanged nods with the amalgam, then the aerial flew from the beach. Flo appeared nervous, but smiled before following after with her own spear. Clyde, who'd had the plan explained to him through our interpreter, then moved down to the water's edge. Joseph went with him, but not before kissing me and telling me to be careful. Then May and I retreated up the shore to our designated spot where we would wait and watch. Even through the haze, we could see the Ariel's bright wings and eyes as they fluttered over the surface of the water. I was encouraged by this. If we could see them, the merfolk could too, and it didn't take them long to do so. There was a splashing commotion, followed by a horrid shriek. Thankfully, it was not from the throat of either Ariel, but rather some unimaginable monstrosity. I tensed as I leaned forward, peering harder into the fog. I could just make out Flo hovering in place, but Remy was flitting frantically about. He'd gotten one, but the creature was fighting, thrashing wildly, trying to loose itself from the end of his spear. Before it could, Remy thrust the weapon deeper into his prey, evidenced by another piercing shriek. The tip lodged into something solid, some intersection of bone probably. That's when Remy maneuvered himself behind the thing, then flapped his wings hard, harder than he ever had before. The aerial became an engine, motoring the creature forward, forcing it across the surface to the shore. When he'd reached the sand, Remy threw out his wings and beat them in reverse, the momentum plucking his spear free as the creature continued on, coming in with the tide. The aerial remained a moment, catching his breath mid-air, watching as Joseph and Clyde moved in to take over. Then he flew back into the fog. My husband and the aquatic worked in tandem to quickly ventilate the creature. Joseph withheld his disgust for the task, while Clyde relished in it, stabbing with furious passion as he sought to avenge his slain fellows. It was soon dead, but more importantly, silent, those unbearable shrieks echoing across the sea into nothingness. Clyde hooked his harpoon into the monster and Joseph one of his barbs. The men used their weapons as fishing gaffs to drag the carcass up the sand to May and I. Despite the smooth terrain and their combined strength, it was still a chore as the monster was hefty. Like Remy had, they paused to recover, but were not permitted to linger long as another terrible scream came in from the sea. The aerial spearmen had already snared a second. Clyde could not hear this, but when Joseph rushed back to the water's edge, the aquatic followed after. It wouldn't be long until the next one was brought ashore, but May and I had a moment with this thing. It was the size of a man, the half of it that was still basically a man anyway. The creature in design is likely what you are imagining, listener. Humanoid torso with arms and a head, but a sizable tail where the legs should be. However, both halves of the monster were united by a single hide. It was not coated in scales, as our aquatic friend was, but rather sheathed in taut gray skin, like that of a shark. This I could see despite the thorough dousing the creature had sustained of its own ink-black blood. There was also a row of jagged spines running from the tip of the tail to the top of the head. Following these with my eyes, my attention shifted back to the top half of the creature. Like I said, it was basically still a man, but I mean that in shape only. There was no humanity left to be seen in this thing. The arms were multi-jointed now, so much so as to have the function and certainly the appearance of tentacles. At the extremity of these limbs, pincers had replaced hands. As for the head of the monster, it was elongated, bulbous in the back with the face of a cuttlefish. If you've never seen a cuttlefish, you might be fooled by its cute name into picturing something adorable. If you have seen a cuttlefish, you know it's hideous. A Cthulhu monster with fingery mouth suckers and wavy pupil devil eyes. Even still, the cuttlefish is a natural animal and has its own appreciable quality for that reason. This monster, however, did not have that, as it was decidedly unnatural. It was an aberration. This was evil trying its hand at creation and utterly failing as only good can create. You'd think I'd be used to monsters by now, wouldn't you? that they'd stop having any kind of effect on me, but that's the thing about horrors. They never stop inspiring it. I was still studying the bloody heap before me when it was suddenly joined by another. Remy had made his second delivery, Joseph and Clyde relaying it to May and I. This one was female, a proper mermaid, but it too was dead by the time it got to us. It was only then, with the two of them combined, that I began to notice their smell. It wasn't rot, as they were freshly dead, but it was similarly putrescent. Everything about these things was repugnant, even their aroma. The 2 we'd collected were soon made 3, then 4. May's plan was working. Mostly. It was only ever Remy who brought the monsters ashore. Despite training with the spear, Flo had yet to snare a single merman or mermaid. May voiced her concern to me, afraid that Remy would exhaust himself too soon. That was the point of her pairing us all together, the classic buddy system. But his buddy wasn't pulling her weight. But then, finally, Flo came soaring across the water, driving one of the monsters to the beach. May smiled, but then quickly frowned. Something was wrong. The merman reared up and attacked with all the life still in him. He'd not suffered a single wound before coming ashore. Flo had failed to lance it. The creature must have simply clung to the end of her spear beneath the waves and let itself be driven in. Maybe they were smarter than we'd thought. Maybe they were learning. Even out of the water and suffocating, they were a force to be reckoned with. Maybe more so because they fought with raw desperation. The merman lunged at Clyde first, swinging both of his tendril arms as one. The blow sent the aquatic sprawling backward into the sand. Joseph rushed it from behind to bury his barbs in the back of it, but the monster twisted and snapped at him with its massive pincers. My husband had to quickly shift from offense to defense, using his gauntlets against its claws as they closed around him. His arms were spared the crushing strength of the merman, but now he was caught in the grasp of it. Joseph was in trouble. There was no thought, only impulse, as I leapt forward, charging down the beach. I had slipped under the interlocked arms of my husband and the creature, slashing at its exposed belly with my saber, but the conclusive blow was delivered by May. She leapt from our place up the shore and glided down to the beach into the conflict, swinging Remy's mace. The momentum of the short flight and the strength of her arm compounded the force with which the warhammer connected with the merman's head. The strike was devastating, skull-crushing. The abomination was dead before it was prone in the sand. As it went down, the creature's pincers came loose and fell away from Joseph's gauntlets. With his arms now free, my husband threw them around me. Still embracing, we both then looked up to Flo, who was hovering over the water's edge, having watched the proceedings. Appalled. Her mistake had almost cost lives. And to make it worse, she hadn't even tried to help correct it. The Ariel could have swooped down at any time to assist us, but she'd panicked and frozen mid-air. She turned her eyes to Joseph, to me, then to May. The Ariel then soared back into the fog, not to help Remy, but to hide her shame. At May's command, Joseph and Clyde resumed their positions, then she and I receded up the shore. Our job wasn't done yet. Unsurprisingly, it was only Remy who brought the other merfolk to shore. His efforts were honestly valiant. I was impressed. The Ariel would, one by one, come flying in from the fog, driving his spear and a monster into the clutches of Joseph and Clyde. But by the time he had made his 7th delivery, Remy collapsed on the beach. He'd pushed himself too far. As the aquatic finished off the monster, my husband went to the Ariel and helped him up. Remy was too exhausted to refuse the assistance of a human, so I knew he was in bad shape. But there was still one more creature out there in the depths somewhere. We were so close to being done. I wondered if perhaps Flo could take care of it, but when Remy did not return to her, she flew in from the sea and landed on the beach beside him and Joseph. With the 3 of them huddled together, Clyde alone dragged the merman up to May and I. He tore his harpoon from the dead flesh, then rolled the carcass next to the others. Doing so, the aquatic counted them, realizing what we had, that there was one left. But our fisherman was spent, something else Clyde then realized. Through his tinted, water-filled helmet, the aquatic stared out with those huge eyes. He was thinking. Then our friend from the sea did a very unexpected thing. He started shedding his apparatus. Clyde disconnected tubes between his helmet and the tanks on his back, water gushing everywhere. I looked to May, but she was just as perplexed. Clyde still had a bit of water in his wetsuit, giving him just enough breath to return to the ocean. He now carried his gear in one webbed hand, the other around his harpoon. We followed him down to the beach and joined with the rest of our companions, collectively watching the aquatic stride into the waves, vanishing beneath them.
What's he doing? There's still one left.
Not for long.
Oh.
Clyde was on the hunt. Now that it was a fair fight, he'd finish avenging his murdered companions. We didn't know how long he would be away, or if he would return at all after killing the last merman, so we took a much-needed rest. At May's direction, our group moved briefly into the shallows of the sea to wash up as best we could after our bloody labors. Leaving the water, we then climbed to the top of the dunes again, returning to the satchels we discarded earlier. We took from them food and water, then sat down in the sand. Our vantage was better up here, plus we were upwind of the reeking monsters we'd spent much of the day collecting on the beach. The manticores came in from the hinterlands to join us. We'd been away from them for too long, and they had begun to worry. It was comforting to have them with us again. Even still, no one spoke. Our mission had been successful, but grueling. We'd helped our new aquatic friend, made the sea safe for him and his kind again. Looking to Remy and Flo, I couldn't imagine them having the strength to fly each of us across the water. Remember, it had taken 3 of them to carry Joseph alone back in Season 2, and now he was clad in armor. Plus, we didn't know how far out, or even where exactly the archipelago was because of this unrelenting fog. If we made the attempt, the Ariels could easily tire out mid-flight, stranding themselves and their cargo in the ocean. Or they could become lost in the fog, flying in circles with the same result. I was out of clever ideas. I leaned on my husband with every intention of dozing off. However, just as my eyes started to close, they widened. We all sat up from our slouches at the sight of Clyde returning from the sea. The aquatic had reapplied his apparatus. From inside of his helmet, he smiled at us gigantically. It was a friendly expression, but the enormity of his mouth and the rows of teeth made it terrifying to behold. It didn't help that there was now a dripping, bloodied black mass clinging to the tip of his harpoon. Before coming up the dunes, he paused at the row of slain merfolk and shook this thing off of his weapon. It was the heart of the final merman, he informed Remy once he'd rejoined us. The manticores took notice of Clyde, but had only the smallest reaction to his presence. They had been among aquatics previously and were therefore not alarmed by the newcomer. Clyde took a seat, folding his legs as he did, the harpoon now laying across his lap. Remy motioned with his hands, expressing his surprise, the surprise of us all, that the aquatic had come back. We'd all shared the assumption that he would return to his people, to inform them of all this, and that they would seek to retrieve their dead. He would, in fact, do all of that, but for now Clyde would be joining our quest. Not until the threat was eliminated completely would he leave this place. We'd cleared the sea of the witch's abominations, but she still remained. None of us argued with him. Honestly, we were glad to have the oceanic warrior. He would be a tremendous help to us. Clyde also mentioned that he'd refilled his water tanks while at sea, as well as his stomach, so he was more than ready for the dry land excursion, assuming there would be one. Remy knew what I did about our poor chances of reaching the island safely, and explained this to Clyde. The aquatic's webbed hand signed nimbly in reply. He had a solution to that. His mount, from which he'd been separated in the ambush, would be returning for him. He said it would smell the blood of their enemy in the water, and know that it was safe to come back. Revenge aside, that's why Clyde had gone out to hunt the last creature, and why he left all but the heart in the sea. Glancing back at Jellybean, I recalled that our saddles were of aquatic design. The people of the sea had domesticated all manner of marine life. I was a little unnerved. Whatever Clyde's mount was, the thing apparently could hold most of us. Frightful as the prospect was of riding an alien whale or whatever, we had our solution, our way across the channel. All we had to do was wait. May, who'd taken no sleep last night, unfurled her bedroll and lay down. Flo and Joseph followed her cue, but I must have caught my second wind because I started asking questions of Clyde, doing so through Remy, curious as I was about the aquatic. We hadn't really gotten a chance to communicate with him since our first meeting. You know, back when he tried to kill us. That was like hours ago, and we were cool now. Remy, tired as he was, didn't seem to mind translating as if he too was interested in getting to know Clyde. I noticed the aerial sign language seemed to be improving with its continued use. We learned that Clyde had a mate, a wife if they used such terms, but they had no offspring yet. By this tidbit, I assumed he was still relatively young, but it was impossible to say whether that was actually true. Not only were there longer lifespans on this world, Clyde's people had their own infinitely unique physiology. We also discovered that he was one of the aquatics to first witness the landing of the Atlanteans. After reporting this to their aerial allies, he'd returned to his own people to do the same, then requested to be sent back with a contingent of warriors to keep watch over the islands. Clyde had brought his apparatus, and with it had gone ashore to coordinate the surveillance with the aerials. While topside, he'd found their slain bodies. Retreating to the water, he found more of the same. His companions had been killed in his brief absence, and now the merfolk came for him. Clyde had narrowly escaped them by fleeing back to the dry land. Yes, we'd learned much about Clyde, but also about the aquatics as a whole. Some of the facts were startling, such as they had the same theology as the aerials. I assumed that some sort of proselytization had taken place between the two kinds, but as it turns out, the people of the air and the water had both come to this belief structure, independent of the other. This revelation had not come as a surprise to either race, as the truth was apparently self-evident. The aquatics also regard the lower depths of the sea in the same way the aerials do the higher reaches of the sky, as holy, as the dominion of the Maker, and therefore off-limits. Obviously, the bottommost portions of any ocean will have temperatures and pressures unlivable, but it was more than that to the aquatics, just as it was to the aerials. If the two peoples were correct in their beliefs, the Creator was both above and below this world, demonstrating an omnipresence. Getting to know Clyde in the aquatics came with an unexpected benefit. I got to know Remy slightly better. He'd not wanted to talk to me, but had been doing so to translate for our new friend. The interaction had softened the aerial's defenses. He'd let his guard down. It also helped that we had been fighting together all day. There's nothing quite like conflict to bring people together. And soon enough, Clyde had phased out of the conversation entirely, leaving it to just Remy and I. Regrettably, our talk didn't last very long.
When did you learn their signing?
Mother taught. She learned young, fought with them in battle for home.
Joseph told me about that. The aquatics came to help the aerials.
Yes, against humans.
He seemed to remember his hate for my kind, or he was, at least, reminded that he was supposed to hate me, and so the aerial stood abruptly. I tried to get him to stay.
But there were also good humans. Humans who came to help. Gentry, Pendergast, the others with them.
Should have stayed on your world. War not happened at all. Worlds are apart, made apart for reason.
You spent a lot of time on Earth. Was there nothing good about it?
Grilled cheese sandwiches.
Oh, that sounds really good. I could really go for one of my grilled cheeses right now.
You're awake?
I am now. Whoa. What is that?
I turned from my husband to the sea again, to the fog. From somewhere out in that soup, a purple glow was showing faintly now. It was distant enough to be coming from one of the islands of the archipelago. Clyde had seen this before. He motioned to Remy when the aerial made a sudden return to our group, having also spotted the eerie light. The aquatic was sure that it was the same radiance he'd witnessed before, and that it was coming from the same place, the centermost of the Lost Isles. Disquieted by this, we began to murmur among ourselves. This woke both May and Flo, whose own eyes ventured out to the eldritch display.
What is happening?
It's her. It's the Grimalkin. She's showing us where to find her.
Then she knows we have dispatched all of her abominations.
So she's alone now. But if she... Joseph? You okay?
Leviathan.
Whereas I had been looking at my husband, he had been looking out to sea. From his sudden change of expression, I knew he'd seen something else. I joined my gaze with his. Even before the purple light faded out, it had been replaced by another wondrous sight. Plying through the water and fog alike, we saw a massive white something coming ashore. The creature did not slow as it approached, but rather sped up, then lurched onto the sand. The thing came fully from the sea, beaching itself. My husband had generically called it a leviathan, as it was, at first glance, a sea monster. But we had done battle with real sea monsters, and this thing was not that. Like I said earlier, natural creatures, even if frightful in appearance or size, have their own innate beauty, and this thing was majestic. The animal was massive, as I've said, but most of the enormity was in its length, not its girth. Its sleek, alabaster body was comparatively slender. The Leviathan was less like a whale and more like a dolphin, I suppose. But as always, using earthly comparisons is ultimately futile. All the creatures of this world are uniquely their own. For instance, the Leviathan's front fins were connected to the rear set by an enormous membrane. The thing did not have flippers, but a pair of wings. Water wings. These would undulate beneath the surface for a graceful swim. Its tail was the engine, and this powerhouse boasted 2 extra pairs of flukes. Now for the head of it. The eyes are what I noticed first. They were large, oblong, and dark, not unlike those of the aquatics. Blackened eyes are frightful to us land dwellers, but for those who live in the depths of the sea, it is commonplace, a necessity for underwater sight. In keeping with its svelte design, the snout was long and narrow, upturned at the tip with a pair of supine nostrils. I was surprised by this, assuming the thing would have had a spiracle, what is fancy verbiage for a blowhole. But the Leviathan had a proper nose and had used it to smell the blood of our vanquished enemies. Besides, a spiracle would have been covered by the lengthy saddle that had been strapped to its lengthier back. It could seat 5, including our aquatic driver, which meant one of the aerials would have to fly. Flo volunteered before the question could even be asked. Remy was still resting, so she would make the flight. It was the least she could do after the debacle earlier. Clyde rose and started down the dunes to the Leviathan to have a reunion with his mount, as Joseph, May, and I turned to ours to bid the manticores farewell. Our amalgam leader set a hand on the head of Guts and closed her eyes, letting the animal sense her intention to leave, but more importantly, to return. Joseph copied her, and I him. We did not want them to feel abandoned, but also we wanted to make sure they would still be waiting for us when we came back from the Lost Isles. Lamre nuzzled Joseph, and he smiled, hugging the massive head of his mount. I was less physical with my goodbye, but I did promise Jellybean extra apples on the way home. The 3 of us then turned to go. The manticore shifted uneasily, unhappy to be separated from the riders again so soon, but they seemed to understand that, as before, it was only temporary. Taking up the satchels and draping them around us, our quintet then descended to the beach once more. Clyde was already atop the Leviathan in the frontmost seat of the multi-rider saddle. He gestured for us to join him. I hesitated, and I wasn't the only one. I looked to my husband, seeing concern on his face. Back at the stables, Joseph couldn't wait to throw himself onto the back of his manticore, but not this thing. Then I realized that his trepidation had nothing to do with the Leviathan at all. It was the awaiting ocean.
Oh, right. The water. And it's not only an ocean, it's an alien ocean.
Not exactly Lake Michigan, is it?
Come, let us be on our way.
This thing knows to stay above the water, right?
Wait, where is he taking us exactly?
The central island, of course.
Where we saw that creepy light?
This is where we will find the Grimalkin and complete our quest.
You just want to go charging into what is obviously a trap? Shouldn't we at least try to, sneak in?
The witch knows we have arrived.
Even still, we shouldn't go straight to her, right? I mean, we know nothing about the Grimalkin.
What would you have us do instead?
Our aquatic friend here said he was one of the first to see the ship, or raft, or whatever, come here. He knows where it ran aground and can take us to it.
To what end?
There might be something, some clue left in the wreckage that will give us a better idea of what to expect. We should try to find out as much about the Grimalkin as we can before we confront her. Based on what we've seen so far, she is very powerful.
Agreed.
May looked to Remy, who'd been standing by listening in, and nodded. The aerial flew our request to Clyde. Hovering before the mounted aquatic, he signed to him, asking that he deliver us to the island with the shipwreck, what was apparently at the far edge of the archipelago. Clyde raised a hand in assent, then used it again to wave us aboard his mount. The Leviathan had been out of the water too long already. The manticores crouched down for their riders to mount, but this creature had no such option to give. It did, however, allow us to step upon one of its massive water wings, which served as a ramp leading up to the body of it. From here, Joseph gave his little wife a boost. The aquatic saddle was familiar, having a comparable design to those gifted to the Strangels. and having spent so much time in one, I was comfortable, except for the fact that it was wet, but there was nothing to be done about that. Joseph then climbed into the seat behind me as May leapt onto the one behind him, Remy fluttering into the last. Once we were all situated, Flo took to the air. She would follow closely from overhead as to not get lost in the fog. Before I could worry about the Leviathan being stuck where it had beached itself, the water wings began to ripple intensely and the whole enormous creature wiggled backward into the water. The manticores watched us from atop the dunes, not jealous of our new mount, but concerned it would not carry or protect us as well as they. The Leviathan's bottom half and wings were submerged now, but its upper portions, as well as its riders, remained above the waves. At Clyde's directing, the long creature turned and thrust suddenly into the ocean, skimming the surface and permeating the fog. We were not spared the briny spray of the sea, but a misting was far better than a dunking in these frigid waters. I looked up to Flo soaring overhead, to check on her. I hadn't consoled my aerial friend after her failure. I'd let her think she'd let us down. Maybe because she had. Even still, everyone errors. I should have made the time to speak with her, and now regretted having not. The fog, as ever, hampered our view, so it was easy to forget that an entire ocean stretched to the horizon before us, or that somewhere along the way, this expanse was interrupted by an archipelago. But we were soon to be reminded. The islands began to push themselves into view, and with them came a memory. I recalled Joseph telling me that when the Ariels banished their earthly enemies here, they had banished the place right along with them. It was no longer considered a part of their world. These were called the Lost Isles for a reason. The invaders had sought to rebuild their civilization here, so many of the islands were now crookedly crowned in the vestiges of once magnificent cities, the jagged skyline standing darkly and silently in the fog. Our eyes turned to the center length of the chain. This is where the giant citadel had stood, then crumbled when it was revealed to be a shell, an upright hangar for a pair of spacecraft. It was there, in this former seat of power, now rubble heap, that the Grimalkin awaited our group. But Clyde steered away from here, the Leviathan carrying us farther down the archipelago. As we went, I entertained a brief comparison between this island chain and the mountain chain, this being an evil reflection of that holy realm. The Leviathan beached itself for a second time, and we dismounted. Clyde made a gesture, one that Remy did not understand, but the creature did. Obeying, it worked itself backward into the sea and disappeared into the water. Unlike the manticores back on the mainland, the Leviathan would not wait here for our return, but rather shadow us from the sea. It had our scent now, and would track us with it across the islands. Clyde explained all of this to us through Remy, adding that his mount would come ashore to retrieve us if needed. I liked having the option of an emergency exit from the Lost Isles. The fog was as thick on this shore as it had been on the other, so when we turned from the water to the land, we could see little of it. Not that it mattered. We were here for the Atlantean shipwreck, to which Clyde then led us. It waited farther down the beach. I could not tell from the splintered hull what the boat had actually looked like. I was reminded of the crashed dirigible back in the plains. It was odd to think that these two vessels were both built and operated by the same people. The drop in technological sophistication had been steep and fast. This boat was obviously less advanced than those that had left these shores so long ago. Remember, after their final defeat, the Atlanteans had been permitted to build ships and venture across the sea to colonize new lands, but they had not flourished there. No, they had sunk into near barbarism. This tattered raft, what remained of it, testified to their degeneration. The Atlanteans were humans, after all, doing what humans do when civilization collapses. We've seen this time and again on Earth. But the analogous history of our two worlds is not why we had come to the wreck. We were here for clues about our enemy. Joseph pointed out that there was no mast or sails, only 2 sets of now fractured benches and a few oars. So they had rowed from across the sea, an impressive but baffling feat. My husband went forward and began sifting through the debris. The first curiosity he found was a small feathered cushion, what was a very out-of-place luxury. The second noteworthy item was a plank of wood bearing a crude hand-painted image, what had probably belonged to the bow of the vessel. Joseph held it up for us to see. Even through the primitiveness of the depiction, there was no mistaking the shape of the black silhouette. The ears, the tail, the paws. It was all decidedly feline. I was surprised by just how surprised I was. We had been operating under the assumption that our enemy was this former pet of Grindel's, this witch in disguise, but it had only ever been just that. an assumption, and one we'd gotten secondhand from a man I'd never even met.
It's her. It's the Grimalkin.
We knew this already.
Not for sure we didn't.
Gentry was sure. He does not make mistakes.
Sure he does.
Explain your meaning, Lindsay.
I had let that slip out, then hoped May had not heard it. When she called me on the comment, I looked to Flo, who shook her head discreetly but sternly.
Nothing. I'm just surprised is all.
Joseph, have you finished here?
We have seen all there is to see, yes. Now we can move on. Maevalesse, do you know if all the viaducts are intact?
Via what?
The manuscripts describe a series of bridges that interconnected the entire archipelago. We'll use them to move island to island. Assuming, of course, they are still crossable.
Many suffered damage in Gentry's campaign here, and all have certainly given in to age and rot by now. So, we
need to be extra careful.
Extra careful indeed.
Are you afraid of this place, May?
I am.
Oh. Okay. Like, why though? Aside from the cat, there's nothing left here to be afraid of.
Even memories can be dangerous, Lindsay. More so here than anywhere else.
I didn't think May was afraid of anything, and was honestly shocked when she freely admitted to it. The amalgam was born here, trained here, so I assumed the memories she dreaded were her own. But that's not entirely what she meant. The ash, the rust, the crumbled walls, the splintered beams, all the ruins of this place, every broken part of it remained possessed of a memory of a dark power that had survived the destruction. And maybe that's why the witch had come here, to possess herself of this memory, to make this dark power her own. Do good, fight evil, repeat. I'm Lindsay Leck, and this is the Endless Elsewhere podcast.